joining us again today is the chairperson of the Senior Officials Meeting, Undersecretary Laura Del Rosario. Yusek Del Rosario will have an opening statement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's an explanation.
Explanation again.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, how many of you were here during my pre-senior officials meeting? Can you please raise your hand? Okay, higher, higher. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, good. So that means what I'm going to talk about today is not as confusing as before, but for the sake of those who have not been here, I'd like to try a new approach because last time I talked about 3 areas that I thought would be important for our economy to grow. If you recall them, I said we have to build our institutions. Remember, we have to build what is an institution. I think based on your sociology, it's an entity, that regulates and that somehow governs the way we do things. Like a school is an institution, the government is an institution, the family is an institution. So when we talk about institution building, we're talking about government basically, how government entities can be better in promoting rules, regulations, so that they're more clean and transparent and, predictable, meaning they're not playing favorites or we're not doing palakasan. And then I also talked about, let's see, social cohesion, when I said that there should be, as much as possible, we should promote access to opportunities so that societies can find means for them to have social mobility, yung para umangat yung kanilang kabuhayan. And then I also talked about, let's see, this is environmental impact. And I said that everything that we do in government or in business should not make it worse for us in terms of the environment, since there's already climate change. I think those of us who have been reading about climate change, we know that some of this is due, of course, to how we behave in relation to nature and how business also does products in relation to nature, right? So that's about environmental impact. So those are the 3, in a way, areas that we're trying to work on. But I want to work now on how we do things because, okay, if these are our objectives, how do we carry them out? So in APEC, there are 3 areas that we're always looking at. We have the private sector, the citizens, the consumers, and then you have the business people, and then you have, of course, government. In the past, APEC was focused more on what government can do for business because we wanted business to thrive, to grow. And why do we do this? Because we consider that business creates employment. And of course, business is the one that will sustain all of us economically. I think all of you should, understand this. You are all employees. Without your employers, you won't have a job. Now, if government doesn't help your employers in terms of regulations, in terms of ease of doing business, you'll also find it hard to find employment, right? So government is working on facilitating business so that while it regulates business, we're here to regulate, meaning so that there won't be abuses. You know very well that we're trying to prevent, for instance, fraud or abuses in terms of labor, that the employers want to abuse labor, and at the same time that they pay taxes, and at the same time that they don't create problems for the environment. So that's government. But for business, because we know that they're the ones that create jobs, we want to make things easier for them, and at the same time, foster innovation. I think during my first PRISM briefing with you, I talked about social cohesion, social equity, and I said the only way to do that, I said, is through education. So the more people study, the more they learn, the more they can connect ideas, the more they can see how things work, and the more they will know what to do with themselves. And I think the more we can compete. People are always afraid of globalization and of opening borders, but I think this comes from the fact that they don't know whether they can compete or not. But for those of us, or for those of you who are very sure of what you are, of what you have and what you are and what you can do, I don't think you'll be afraid of competition. In fact, some of us purposely look for competition so that we can test our skills. If you look at my use of very familiar example, I'm sure you'll appreciate this. For instance, our boxers, we're famous for our boxers. Haven't you noticed that they compete with one level, then another level? They want to see how it is. Our boxers will not, you know, those who are in sports, will not know how much they can do until they compete outside. Even our basketball players, they compete against other schools, and then they study their techniques so that they can improve their own way of playing. Okay, so in that sense, that should be the private person. If you learn how to study and then how to compete, then you know that you can do better. So if you multiply those private persons and consider them as businesses, then definitely businesses will expand and will grow if they can become better. And perhaps they might be able to overtake the other businesses. I mean, a very good example, of course, we all know it. Look at what happened to Jollibee. Jollibee competed with the giant McDonald's, but right now we think in the Philippines at least and in Asia, Jollibee can go, toe to toe, so to speak. Pwede niyang labanan, di ba? On an equal basis. So I'm sure that Jollibee by now has more than 1,000 outlets all over the world, including Middle East, in Asia, and in the US. So that's the second component. Okay, so we started with government, and then the business, and then, of course, the community, the people. Now, as far as the people are concerned, I've already exhausted the discussion on the need for them to be trained in how they can become skilled workers or better innovators. But we are also looking at what makes up the private sector in that sense, beyond business. In APEC now, we're starting to look at communities. And for some people, they think that in the past, APEC had no meaning. But now, during our hosting, we're focusing on communities. So, what are the initiatives that we did? For instance, in health, our health department and all our health workers had a series of meetings on health. I think they had something on life sciences, and they also had a high-level meeting on health and the economy. And in that meeting, they agreed among APEC economies that they will continue to work on disease prevention and response, disease preparedness. And of course, we're trying to put also our own initiative on resilient communities and sustainable communities. During this meeting, we discussed what we call the senior disaster officials will do. And you are familiar with them. They are led by General Alex Pama, and he's the head of the Office of Civil Defense. And these people will hold their own meeting across APEC, and they're working on various ways to mitigate disaster and at the same time how to improve their emergency response. One of the things that we're working on in APEC are on these initiatives, which I think you will find very interesting. One is how to facilitate the movement of emergency goods and emergency equipment. We know very well that when goods come in the Philippines, customs check them. They want to find out whether these are smuggled goods, and they also want to find out whether these goods are highly taxable or not. And of course, they look at the equipment, what would be used, and therefore, just the processing at customs can take time, isn't it? But during disaster, there is an agreement that there should be a facilitation of goods, like halimbawa, the medicines that should come in should not be subjected to tax and customs because these medicines will go to the communities that will really benefit from those medicines. Okay. The equipment that will be used, for instance, especially during an earthquake, the extraction of bodies from buildings, the cranes, and even perhaps even the helicopters when we have to borrow, vehicles that will move equipment and people, and of course supplies. There should be a facilitation of their entry into the community where they're needed. And also, of course, it goes with people. Ordinarily, a foreign doctor cannot practice in the Philippines. But if there's a need for a specialist who, assuming we have a shortage of specialists, then we should allow these foreign doctors to come into the Philippines to address the situation. We cannot be protectionist in that sense because this is an emergency situation. So in effect, we're opening up borders in times of disaster, and this goes, of course, with our own government's response that it should be ready to take in outside help, because we all know that all economies, whenever they're afflicted, they announce their need for help, and I don't think there's an economy who did not welcome any help. I think even during the time of the Japanese disaster and the tsunamis, the Filipinos helped. I mean, helping a far richer country because it's during these times when even if you have the money, you might need the human resources or the people who will help you carry them out. So because of the meeting of the health officials, for instance, they committed themselves really to doing more things to make sure that APEC remains healthy. Now, why is this important? We are already looking at the possibility that there will be, in the future, there will be pandemics. We know that because pandemics can easily spread. If you notice, if you recall, when the Ebola broke out in the Middle East, the government sent doctors to the Middle East, in Africa, rather in Northern Africa, to make sure that if there are Filipinos who are afflicted by Ebola, they can be assisted by our Department of Health, so that they can be quarantined where needed and they don't have to go home to the Philippines and spread the Ebola virus. So we're looking at these preventive measures so that we can confine diseases where they need to be confined, and at the same time we can strengthen our own capacity to address this. So we're looking also at building health systems that have complementary and traditional medicines backing them. I think more and more the APEC economies realize that we don't have to rely only on medicines, generated by developed countries using their own researches. We are trying to encourage researches in our own traditional medicines because we know that our own forests and our own herbs, they contain ingredients that will help us address certain diseases. So that's one. I think I just covered health and disaster preparedness, but let me go back to the other sections that I think you will appreciate. Going back to the community, of course, we also discussed what we call sustainable and livable cities. I discussed this earlier during my pre-senior officials meeting. Now, we had a forum on cities, and we discussed it also during our Friends of the Chair on urbanization. Urbanization now is a big, big problem in APEC economies because we realize we're thinking ahead. We realize also that in the future, 60% of the population of a country will be living in urban areas. So when you look at cities, they're growing, from a few 100,000 to a million to a few millions. And if you look at mega cities like Shanghai, Mexico, where else? Beijing, Metro Manila, Tokyo, New York. These are all in APEC economies. We know that we have to deal with pollution, with transportation, with water supply. So there were experts, for instance, who shared their technologies and talked to those who can implement this, to city mayors and also to the urban planners. And they said, if you need assistance in improving your water supply so that when you catch rainwater, then maybe this is how you can treat rainwater. Just to give you an example, Singapore doesn't have any source of water. Unlike us, we have the mountains, we have the rivers. You look at Singapore, how big is it? It's just about 650 square kilometers. It doesn't have any lake, right? It doesn't have any mountains. So where does it get its water? Definitely, you can say, well, it's surrounded by what? The sea, right? Between Malaysia and down there in the South China Sea, so to speak, or even near the Strait of Malacca. But somehow we know that desalination is a very expensive process. So there are some technologies out there that are coming from the business sector, and this is where the business sector will come in, and they say, we can help you with your problem. This is our technology. And there are some people who say that, like in the case of Singapore, they can talk about how they capture water during the rain. What they did was they capture everything, every drop of water that drops into the city, and it's stored underground. You know, it flows to the drainage, but once it flows into the drainage, it's treated, and it comes out as water, either to be used by companies for industries, or to be used by agriculture, or to be used by people. So these are the innovation things that's happening that for us we are not very conscious of or aware of, because as far as we know, as soon as we open our faucet, there should be water. But there's so much thinking going on how you distribute water, and how you clean water, and how you provide more and more potable water for the growing population. So that cities issue is also very important to us. And then, of course, again, going back, this is on the private sector side, what private sector can do in terms of water. And of course, for the government, what can it do in terms of water? Of course, it has to make sure to regulate, the distribution of water, that there's no abuse in terms of the cost. I want to share with you an experience. I won't tell you the country because I know I'm being streamed alive. But I have had experience in a country where individuals and NGOs protested about water being sold to soft drink companies. I mean, for us, they would say, why? Because for them, when water is sold to the soft drink companies, this water becomes soft drinks. You add water, you add sugar, you add flavor. And a bottle of water to them, which should cost only perhaps 5 to 10 pesos, suddenly becomes 25 to 35 pesos, isn't it? So they say it's unfair. They said, we want more water because that particular country has water shortage. So they said water should not be sold to be converted into sugared water by soft drinks. So you see what an interesting situation this is. So they asked their government to limit the selling of water to business, so that the community can access more cheap water, which is of course treated by government. Now, water is also an issue for us. So if you look at the community issues that we're looking at health, we're looking at education, we're looking at water, we're also looking at the internet. Somebody asked me last time, and he said, what are you doing about the internet? Why is it? Why is APEC getting into it? Because for some of us, as long as we have Wi-Fi, we think that's the whole story, isn't it? But for some of us, the internet is an enabler. It enables people to become better. You learn from the internet. You get your information from the internet. The internet can be an educational tool, but at the same time, it can also be a tool for abuses. I think some of you must have experienced the fact that sometimes you get a spam mail and they said, kaibigan mo ako'y nandito sa bansang ito, naubusan ako ng pera, pwede magpadala ka ng pera sa akin. That can be also a scam through the internet. So we're talking about security, and also we're talking about how to regulate the internet so that at least there's some kind of control. There's also cyber security, isn't it? That is also being taken up in APEC, but that's under another working group. And I'm sorry, I cannot expound on that. Once they do that, I mean, they're working on that. There's what we call an ad hoc steering group on the internet economy. It's newly formed, bagong silang lang. It's, I think, 1 week old. And we're trying to work on all the things that the internet economy should be doing. And of course, we're also talking about going back to business. Now, what does business want? I think Secretary Balisacan has already told you about the structural reform and how we're trying to make rules for business easier. Because sometimes business is hampered by the regulations. But these regulations should be predictable and they should be uniform. Like, okay, let's take an example. When you buy a product, do you look at the label? In certain economies, they want labeling. They want to know what makes up this product. So for those of you in Cebu, if you want to sell piyaya or otap, you have to make sure how much percentage of sugar is there, how much percentage of fat is there, whether it's saturated fat or polyunsaturated fat. They want to know how much flour you put there, whether it has gluten, because there's some people who have gluten allergies. Now, people might say, ang dami-dami naman nilang hinihingi. Of course, if you want to break into the international market, you must have all this information, because there are some people who cannot eat rice because of gluten, or flour that has gluten. And the more clean your product is, the more transparent you are, the more high level your labeling is, the more consumers you will have. And I think for us Filipinos, we are not very conscious of this, isn't it? As long as it's there, we think it's good, and that's why, maybe that's one reason why diabetes is rising in the Philippines, why what they call lifestyle diseases are also increasing. People are getting more heart attacks and strokes, and even people who are not very rich, right? We think it's only the rich who get stroke and heart attacks, but it's our lifestyle. I'm sure in Cebu you have very high cholesterol because of your lechon, right? And I'm sure you have high diabetes because of your piyaya. I don't know, are you monitoring this? But definitely in Metro Manila, the number of dialysis centers are increasing. I mean, when I go to the provinces also, I said, oh my, I said, more and more the dialysis also for diabetics, for those with kidney problems. It's because we are not very conscious yet of what we consume, and we are not demanding yet of what we should require, food companies to do. So I try to focus on what APEC does in terms of the community individuals, and what we're trying to do with business, so that business can generate more jobs, can make it easier to do business so that they can generate more jobs, and what we do in government to make sure that we protect you, the consumers, and that we also help business provide the opportunities so that our labor market will improve. I hope this briefing is substantial enough. I cannot cover all the issues, because if I do, it will take us another 2 hours at least, because we do cover a lot. We have been here since what, August 24? So we've been here for 2 weeks. Okay, thank you very much. I'm open to questions from the floor.
Thank you, Undersecretary Del Rosario. We would like to remind everyone to kindly raise your hand if you have a question for Yusek Del Rosario, and to avoid non-APEC related questions. May we have the first question? Yes, ma'am, please.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Joyce Balancho from UNTV. Ma'am, what makes Philippine hosting of APEC very unique from how the other countries hosted it before?
I think it's because we focus on communities and on individuals. If you look at our priorities, we have 4, right? We talk about the big issues are where usually other communities focus on regional economic integration, which for some people is policy too high up there, and these are the things that people like NEDA will work on, or trade will work on. But what NEDA and trade have decided is to focus on the small and medium enterprises. So as we work on regional economic integration, we're focusing on how we can help SMEs. That will be the topic of the SME ministerial meeting, and the Boracay Action Agenda. You can ask me additional questions on that later, but I just want to go straight to the point. The third one, as I said, we focused on sustainable and resilient communities, because we want to prepare communities as a whole, and individuals in particular, to be able to live in a changing environment where there will be more disasters. We recognize that there's a new normal, and we recognize that the government and the private sector must work together in facing the challenges of the new normal. And of course, we have the fourth priority, it's human capital investment. We just had high-level policy dialogue on science and education, science and technology and education. I think in my previous briefing I already mentioned that education, especially in science and technology, is very important because right now, the things that will save us from most of the things that we are facing will really be science and technology. Okay?
Next
So, do
question.
you want me to repeat those? It's human capital investment, sustainable resilient communities. So, this is where we're addressing health, disaster preparedness, and of course, infrastructure. We're talking about building quality infrastructure. This goes into our own finance minister's process. The finance ministers will discuss how to attract investments in quality infrastructure. And then SMEs, we're talking about how can SMEs be improved, definitely through e-commerce. That's why internet comes in, because e-commerce, this is when you do business across borders or across beyond your community, and you, in a way, you put up a storefront in cyberspace. You put a website so people can order your goods, and then you have to make sure that when you send it, it arrives at the destination. So we're even talking about transportation, you see. But I did not touch it here anymore because the transportation ministerial meeting, which will be held here also in Cebu, right? You can ask the transport ministerial people what they're doing in terms of transportation when it comes to APEC. Alam niyo, tuhog-tuhog talaga yung mga issues because our lives really are covered by various aspects that we're working on. Okay, and then of course I said health is one of them. So that's sustainable and resilient communities. Okay, next
Next
question.
question. Yes, ma'am, please again.
Ma'am, how do the delegates find Cebu City so far? Is there any relevance to the topics now that we're talking about?
Cebu?
Yes, Cebu, and the location, which is Cebu.
I mean, you're trying to see why we chose Cebu?
Yes, ma'am. And how
Okay.
do the delegates so far find the city?
Okay, when we decided to host APEC, we decided to have APEC hosted in various cities. And we asked the cities to compete and to pitch, meaning tell us why we should host an APEC meeting there. One of our requirements, of course, is that the infrastructure should be good enough, that there are enough hotels, that it is safe enough so that we don't have to worry about, the safety and security of the delegates, that it has enough places that they can visit, and of course, that it is interesting enough. And I think their visit here, some people say, has been very good. In fact, there's a joke that all the delegates so far have consumed more than 2,000 kilos of mangoes. So that's very good for the mango producers. And I think I see them taking their mango shakes, and every dessert is always a mango. And one senior official said, I cannot have enough, he said, of enough of mango. So it looks like they really took advantage of the fact that they're in Cebu. So I told them, I said, I'm glad you're enjoying Cebu. I said, please, when you go home, make sure you get a medical check on your sugar level. I said, because you might be, or maybe you should walk every night so that the sugar level. I mean, just kidding. But at the same time, they say it's a very pleasant city, and the fact that there are malls, I suppose they're happy that our malls are of the level that that their economies have. And we were invited to the exquisitely Filipino, right? And the creations, of course, of the designers and the accessories, they really enjoyed them. And of course, last night during the cultural show, the dances, and again, the fashion show of Philippine fabrics and Philippine fashion since the time of our grandmothers to the present, it was shown there. And I suppose because of that, I'm sure they have formed a very pleasant impression of Cebu, and I think they would not mind coming back in the future. And I hope that it has generated enough business for the local communities here, the service providers, those who sell trinkets and souvenirs. Okay.
Next question.
Good evening, ma'am. Jean Antiporta of Radyo ng Bayan. In your opening statement, you mentioned that APEC is committed to the prevention of pandemics. How does APEC plan to do this?
We're actually forming networks. Just like in anything, a network is important. And I think they're trying to look at measures on how they can improve surveillance of diseases and how they can improve response and recovery systems for public health emergencies. And even as a basic requirement, they want to improve health emergency preparedness, even assuming there's no pandemic across the region, even if it's just an epidemic, within one country. And they also try to address non-communicable diseases, like disabilities, including mental illness. This is something that perhaps it is an undercurrent issue that the Philippines has tried to bring out. The fast pace of growth and rapid urbanization, it creates certain maladjustments among all of us, so that some people do develop psychological incapacities. I don't want to call them mental illnesses yet. I'm talking about, although of course technically, medically, they call them mental illness, except that for some people, they think when you're mentally ill, you deserve, to go somewhere else, away from the public. But they're looking at this because there's a growing trend, I think, among certain people towards partial depression and all that. So, because this affects the productivity of a country, they did some studies, and based on their meetings, they said that one third of the GDP. I'm just looking at my girls. They said one third of the GDP, or there's a big percentage of our production which is being affected by health issues. Definitely, a person who is sick is not productive, and at the same time, the illness adds to the burden of the family. So it's a double whammy. So, for instance, if your father gets sick, you lose an income earner, at the same time you have to take care of him. So it's a double loss for a family. And so we're also trying to encourage collaboration in research and innovation for the health systems, and of course encouraging public-private partnership to address health-related issues. If you notice, in APEC, we're very strong on public-private cooperation, because we know that not every government can really handle all their problems alone, no matter how rich, because they still have to rely on the private sector. And for the private sector, that doesn't mean that they're doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. There is that to a certain extent. But some of them also do earn, isn't it, from certain challenges that the government tries to ask them to help in. Like, for instance, if the government says we need to build more hospitals, because if we build all public hospitals, then our resources might not be enough to build more. So they encourage the establishment of private hospitals. And so this is where the public-private partnership comes in. And of course, going back to medicine, I think it was the government that really encouraged generic medicines way back around 20 years ago, when people did not want to take generic medicines because they said, baka fake yan, baka walang visa, right? Now, through these years, everybody seems to be going now towards generic medicine. And that is because of public-private, partnership, and which we're trying to promote in APEC. Okay. I'm sorry, mahaba masyado mga answers ko, no? You don't mind, because I'm trying to explain as much as I can. Other questions?
Can we have the next question, please?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
No more?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Here. And then, sir, later.
We have two more, in other words, that young man over there. Yeah.
Good afternoon po. I'm
Mm.
Mitch from the Freeman newspaper. During the Yolanda tragedy, there are lots of foreign donors donated
Iha,
their.
this is APEC. I cannot respond to that
No, ma'am, in
question.
relation to the donations for disasters, ma'am, there's a lot of donations na expired, like medicines and water.
As I
How
said,
can we
ah.
prevent this? Na this will not occur if ever we have a disaster such as Yolanda.
That's what we're looking at, isn't it? We said we're trying to facilitate movement of goods and people and equipment during disasters. Don't think this is peculiar to the Philippines, because there are some economies that are so protective of their industries, like for instance, there's an economy. Remember, okay, I won't mention a country because I'm streamed. There was a particular country in Southeast Asia that refused to take donations during a typhoon. Alam mo yun, no? Anong bansa yun? For the same reason, they're protecting their products. In our case, it's we have to go through those hurdles. Also, remember, even countries that give exports, they also check what's being given out. And at the same time, also, we want to make sure that donations are also those of good quality. Okay. May I put this off for the meantime? Right, no, because the donations might stop coming in because they said the senior officials said we're giving this kinds of donation. But what I'm saying is that that can be a possibility. But as I said in APEC, we're looking at the quality and the facilitation aspect of it. Definitely, we cannot just let things go through, right? Because then later on, for all you know, prohibited drugs are being being processed through this. We're also afraid of that. There might be some donations for disasters, and then some people might choose that to insert prohibited drugs that will be sold in the market. That can also be disastrous. It's a disaster, creating another disaster. It is very hard to be in government, believe me, because you have to look at facilitating and at the same time regulating. You have to look at opening at the same time protecting, because there has to be a very good balance on this. And we know very well that there's some people who are very creative in using facilitation issues to do their own, unpleasant objectives. Okay.
Yes, sir, please.
Good evening, Yusek Del Rosario. I am Ben De Vera of Philippine Daily Inquirer.
Yeah, I know you.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Um,
Yeah.
one of my co-reporters was wanted to ask how productive was the SOM3 after.
Very,
and
very, very productive. I think they know that we tried to cover a lot. I mean, some of the things that I mentioned to you are just some of the things that we have discussed. I have not discussed 50% or more than 50% of the issues because they're above the immediate interests of an ordinary person, and also because they cover regulatory reform. The work on regulatory reform is huge. I mean, just reading the report made me feel like I need another 2-year course in economics. They're doing a lot in terms of improving regulations so that an individual or a company is not hampered. And I think you will, Ben, you will know more about this during the structural reform ministerial meeting, because that's where they're focusing on. The work of the economic committee will find fruition, so to speak, in the structural reform.
Yes,
Now, if Secretary Balisacan was here, I'm sure he has already said
and-
a lot about
Yes,
that.
ma'am. And just 2 quick follow-up questions. This will be the penultimate meeting before the final one
Mm-mm.
in Manila in November. What else would be discussed in November? What would be in the agenda of the senior officials meeting? And another would be, the last question would be, how prepared is the government to host the leaders meeting, the heads of state, and how many will be here? Do you have the final figure 2 months ahead of
Okay.
them?
In the final meeting of the concluding senior officials meeting, and when they go up to the senior officials, to the ministers, definitely all the things that we're discussing now, the things that I mentioned, from the internet economy, transportation, structural reform, health, education, disaster, they will all go up to the to the joint ministers meeting of foreign affairs and trade. But there are two issues here that are what we call the big policy issues. One will be on services cooperation. Services is a concept that is very hard for some people to accept or to understand, because if you look at the list of services, I'm sure there are at least 200 services in the world. Like what you're doing right now is a service. Media is a service. Okay, the people who who did my clothes or who did your clothes, that's a service. It's a creative service. And of course, hospitality is a service. But there are also services that are related to manufacturing. For instance, when you manufacture a car, somebody designs the car, that's a service. Somebody produces the chair, or rather the seat, and again, that's a service, design. And then somebody will design the shape, and somebody will decide on what upholstery there will be, and somebody will design the engine, somebody will decide on what color it should be done. Somebody will spray paint it, somebody will weld it. So how many services are these? During one presentation, I was told that to produce one car, I don't know which particular car, 77 services were needed, including transportation and logistics, including warehousing, including advertising, including after maintenance service. Now, that will be done. And why are we doing it? Because we are looking at the possibility that if we discuss the opening up of services, Filipinos, with their ingenuity, might be able to capture a service that they can develop, which is uniquely part of manufacturing. People are already looking at, how about brokerage? Can't we not? Brokerage is a service. Some people sometimes are not looking at this. But for instance, our designers maybe can be used to design, bottles, the bottle used in water and so on. And so we want to invite other services here so that we will learn from them. Even education is a service. We hope that the time will come when we can allow foreign educators, to teach partly in the Philippines. So that's the big agenda. This, I'm sure, will take more than 10 years to achieve, because there's so many kinds of services and we have to build a different roadmap for every services sector. Are you still with me? Okay. Hindi pa kayo nawawala, ha? Okay. So, assuming there are for us 20 major services sectors, lahat yan gagawin natin ng roadmap, so to speak. So that's the big agenda, because it's complicated. People have to see the restrictions, okay, on these services. Some of us don't know them because we are not there yet, or we don't know what they are. And the other thing is a discussion on how we can improve the quality of growth. I think all of you have been reading papers say, yumayaman nga ang bansa pero marami naman ang walang trabaho. It is not just here in the Philippines, it's everywhere else. In the United States, where you have those Occupy Wall Street, diba? They say, why is it the income of the middle class has gone down compared to the previous years, and the income of the rich have gone up? So it's as though the middle class is being hollowed out. They're going down, they're becoming lower middle class, they're becoming lower class. So we're trying to look again at the regulations, at why it's becoming like that. In one discussion at lunch, they're going to look for research on why trade is slowing. Bakit bumabagal ang trade? Is it because people are buying less? Is that one reason? Because it is chicken and egg, di ba? Kung hindi ka bibili, walang mamamatay ang produkto, di ba? Yung production. So if people won't buy anything, the production will slow down because nobody's buying. And because nobody's buying, shops will close down, di ba? Because there's no sales and therefore you're losing money, so you close your factory. So in other words, it's almost as though you have to buy just to keep on creating. It's a market phenomenon that the more people consume, the more jobs are being created. But once you stop that and they see if people are still consuming, why is it trade is slowing down? Where is it coming from? These are the things that governments now, these are the things that we are starting to discuss. And so we're looking at quality growth. Again, I'm looking at, I said, how do we build institutions? How do we build schools? How do we build innovation? How do we build communities so that when there's fast change happening, we can deal with them? At least, if we're not totally ready, at least we're partially ready and we are not caught by surprise. And definitely, the individual and the community's actions are very, very important. In short, it starts with each one of us. And we're trying to build this consciousness in governments and in the private sector. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
How prepared are we to host the heads of state, and how many would
Very.
we expect?
Very. I'm saying very because we planned this way back in 2012.
Would they all be here? Would all 21?
All 21 economies will be here. Nobody has skipped an APEC meeting because they don't want to lose out on the discussion.
So even China, the
Oh,
Chinese.
yeah. China will be here. China will be here.
Thank
Okay.
you, ma'am.
Now, I don't think, you know why? If you miss a meeting like APEC, it is one of the biggest meetings in the world. I kept talking about in one of my interviews, there are two big summits in the world, economic summits. They are the G20 and APEC. And everybody wants to be there. In fact, you know why they want to be there? Because they also want to meet one another, right? Renew ties, discuss, bilateral issues among themselves, and compare notes. Okay, trying
Okay.
to tell one another best practices. Okay.
Do we have, maybe we can just have like one last question. One last. Okay. If we don't have any more questions, we'd like to thank you, Sec Del Rosario, for taking the time to speak with us
Thank you very
this
much.
evening.
I
And-
hope, simple lang, na naintindihan niyo ako, no? If you say yes, I'll be very, very happy. Naintindihan niyo ako. Thank you. Okay, that's my best. Okay,
Thank
okay,
you,
thank
Sec.
you.
Good day, everyone.
Yeah. Because sometimes may nagko-complain, ma'am, ang bilis-bilis niyo magsalita, tsaka kung minsan yung mga concepts niyo kung saan-saan, nandoon, nandito. So, okay, now I'm here. Salamat po. See you again in Manila in November. Okay.